And I'm really excited to talk to you about manure today, every girl's favorite topic. It's better than being covered in it, and that's what I usually look like, so it's an upgrade. All right, so fertilizer value of manure. What I'm going to share with you today is based on a research project we did at the University of Minnesota that was funded by Extended Ag Services. But before I share that with you, I thought I would go over a little bit of how we wound up going down this research path in the first place. What got us interested in fertilizer value of manure? So I'm sure everyone realizes, unless you've been living under a rock, that the U.S. cow inventory is the lowest it's been since the 1950s. What we tend to attribute this to is drought and high feed prices during the late 2000s. But what we tend to forget is that we've really been in a slow but steady decline in cow numbers since the mid-1990s. So what does this mean? Well, it means that we no longer have enough cows to support the infrastructure that we've developed. A lot of open pen space in the southern parts of the country, like Brett talked about earlier, as well as the closures of packing plants. Right here in the middle, Emporia, Kansas, 2008, that was really the first major constriction of the beef cattle industry. We saw the closure and repurposing of a fed cattle plant. Fast forward to 2013, this is Plainview, Texas, closed another fed cattle plant. 2014, does everyone remember all the news on Brawley, California's closure? Pretty much decimated the cattle feeding industry in that part of the country. Beyond that, we've lost some coal plants as well. This star down here in San Antonio, Texas, is a coal cow plant. San Antonio, famous for the Riverwalk, no longer killing 200,000 cows per year. A little bit closer to home for us, the Dakota Pride plant in South St. Paul shuttered its doors this summer, will not reopen. And in the same week, another cow plant in Wisconsin closed as well. And really the question isn't if another plant is going to close, it's where and when. There's been quite a bit of talk about a couple potential plants right in the Oklahoma, Texas panhandle up into Kansas potentially closing. Now that really sounds very doom and gloomy, especially since the talk we just listened to at lunch was really positive. So that being said, we see some interesting things here in Iowa specifically. So this green star is the plant that opened in Tama, Iowa, last month, I think, the month before. And there's another smaller plant opening in Lime Springs next year. What this suggests to me is something really interesting. Why in the world would we be opening smaller plants? Both of these are associated with some sort of branded beef program when we see all these feedlot or packing plant closures across this country. Well, what it suggests to me is that there might be this potential shift in the packing industry model. Maybe now we are moving our plants closer to where some more cattle are being fed, and I'll talk about that shift a little bit. And we're no longer looking at these mass capacity. We're looking at a smaller scale. Now, whether or not these are successful and this trend continues remains to be seen. So, talk about cattle moving north. It's something we've talked about for a while. This slide is my depiction of the Great Migration. And the reason that we've been talking about cattle moving north for a while are our resources. Obviously, we have cattle. We have water. That's been a big one in a lot of cattle-producing states in the last couple of years. And then, of course, our inputs. We grow a lot of corn, as all of you are intimately familiar with. And our corn co-products. The majority of biorefineries are centered right here in the upper Midwest. And that's had a drastic impact on our cattle feeding industry. So if we look at cattle on feed inventory, this is one-time capacity. We see some interesting shifts in where cattle are being fed over time. So we see this top line is the Texas, Oklahoma, and we're comparing 2000 all the way to 2014. And during the late 2000s, early 2010s, we saw a pretty drastic decrease in cattle being fed in that part of the country. They lost 630,000 head spaces. A lot of that would be the impact of the drought. Now, Nebraska, one of our close neighbors, is this gray line right here, and it's bounced up and down over time, but it's pretty much ended in about the same place. So they have an additional 10,000 head spaces. In Nebraska, that's one feedlot. What's interesting is this line right here. That's the Iowa, South Dakota, Minnesota complex, so the upper Midwest. And we compare feedlot capacity in 2000 to 2014, we see an increase in 105,000 head spaces. That's pretty substantial, especially considering a lot of those are going to be smaller yards. Now, if we think about seeing this pretty big increase that happened during the late 2000s and look at market conditions over those times, it's maybe a little bit puzzling at first glance. So what we have here is corn price marketing per year, and then the Iowa, Southern Minnesota fed cattle prices. So the maroon line is our corn prices. The red is our cattle prices. During the late 2000s, when we saw that significant increase in cattle feeding capacity, we saw a drastic increase in corn prices. Everyone remembers that. And while fed cattle prices did increase, it wasn't nearly to the same magnitude. Now fast forward to today, and things look a little bit different. Of course, we don't have a composition for the year yet. 2014 is not over, but spot prices put corn back down in the $3 range, and fed cattle prices are actually off my chart. We just keep breaking records. So things look pretty different. But we think back during that period of major expansion, a lot of that expansion was occurring with some pretty significant investments in confinement buildings. So why were these folks and their bankers, who are not stupid, willing to make that investment when fed cattle prices weren't necessarily supported by corn prices? Well, and that's because we have this integrated crop and livestock system. All of you know this, but for the sake of my linear thought, we'll run through it real fast. In the upper Midwest, we produce crops, corn specifically. You're going to send part of that to the elevator, and a portion will be fed to your cattle. Market conditions will dictate how much goes in which direction each year. And as Alfredo will share, I think, a little bit later, there are actually some years we are adding value to our corn by walking it to town through our cattle. But either way, you're going to have cattle on feed. And what do cattle do really well? Produce manure. A couple tons a year. They're very, very good at that. Now, if you're a cattle feeder without a land base, manure is a byproduct that you have to get rid of. However, if you are a cattle feeder who also produces crops, manure becomes a co-product that has value. And that value has gone up pretty significantly when we saw these major increases in commercial fertilizer prices. So when we thought about all of this expansion and a lot of it being confinement buildings, we wanted to focus on this manure aspect of the integrated crop and livestock cycle. And I say integrated crop and livestock because I don't really like the term farmer feeder. So I don't think farmer feeder necessarily reflects how advanced the cattle feeding industry has become in the upper Midwest today. So, to the famous research project that I promised I would share with you today, we asked the question, when considering expansion, how does manure figure into feedlot facility design decisions? So we had hundreds of samples from feedlots all over the upper Midwest, kindly provided to us by Extended Ag Services, and we broke them into three main categories. Open lot, so it's going to have a concrete or dirt surface, combination of the two. Bed pack under some sort of roof, and finally a slatted floor over a deep pit. So if I were to ask y'all, I bet you didn't know there would be a quiz, which of these different facility types would do the best in capturing manure, what would you say? The pit, absolutely. You're going to capture the most manure nutrients. After that, what's intermediate? The bed pack, yep, and open lot is going to do the poorest job capturing our manure nutrients. Well, that was pretty simple, right? Everybody knew that, so why are these idiots at Minnesota doing research on it in the first place? Well, even though that's really obvious, we were interested in actually defining the difference and putting a dollar value on it. So it's something you can take to your banker if you're thinking about expansion, or when you sit down and look at the books for your entire operation, not your crop and your cattle feeding separate, but put it all together and look at total farm profitability. That's what we were interested in discovering with this particular research project. So, the results I'm going to share with you today focus on four primary nutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur. I want to go ahead and point out now that all of the phosphorus values are as phosphate, and potassium is shown here today as potash. But before I do share those with you, briefly want to talk about phosphorus a little bit. So, some really smart people looked at the world phosphorus supply, and they've decided we've either reached our peak phosphorus supply back in the 1980s, when I was in diapers, or we were about to reach it in the the 2033 is what that says. So that makes conserving our phosphorus nutrients pretty important. And what is a great way to conserve and recycle phosphorus? Through manure, right? So we think about, where is this phosphorus located? Well, we are a net importer of phosphorus. This is the United States right here, -4. Some of the countries that currently have the world phosphorus supply aren't necessarily the friendliest countries. Therefore, it behooves us to do what we can to use our nutrient use, sustainably, in order to avoid situation in the future where we maybe don't have access to phosphorus, which of course we need to produce crops. Beyond that, anytime you talk about phosphorus, we have to talk about the negative impacts of phosphorus on the environment. As we all know, excess phosphorus in the environment it's called eutrophication, which ultimately can result in algae blooms. So this is an aerial photo of Lake Erie. This bright green, nasty looking stuff is an algae bloom. So does anyone remember this summer there was a drinking ban in Toledo, Ohio? There was like 3 or 4 days they couldn't drink the water. That was associated with toxins produced by this nasty looking algae bloom. In the media, who did they blame this algae bloom on? Who had the big target on their back? Production agriculture. Us, you guys. They didn't talk about wastewater treatment facilities. They didn't talk about residential lawn fertilization practices. How many of you have been driving through town? You've seen the weather, you know it's going to rain, but you see someone out there fertilizing their lawn, right? It happens. It's not just us. We're not the only contributors. However, we are the ones with the target on our back. So it just behooves us to keep this in mind and be proactive about our phosphorus use in the environment. And a lot of cattle feeders already do that. They spread manure on a phosphorus crop need basis rather than nitrogen. And I know this is something you guys take into account in your manure management plan here in Iowa anyways, but just something to keep in mind. I don't say this to be the phosphorus boogeyman because there are a lot of places that do need some pretty significant phosphorus for crop needs, just not everywhere. All right, so finally to the famous research project. So it might be a little bit hard to see back there, and I apologize for that, but I'll walk us through all of these slides. So this particular one shows solid manure. This is pounds of nutrient per ton of manure. On the far left, I have to do that every time, we have our outdoor lot. Intermediate, we have a bed pack, and on the far right, we have our stockpile. Now, I didn't mention stockpiled manure when I originally introduced our different options, and the reason for that is this category is a little bit ambiguous, but it's going to primarily consist of fresh scraping, so we're not going to focus on that too much. Now, the maroon bar is going to be nitrogen, the red bar is phosphate, and finally the yellow bar is potash. So in comparing the outdoor lot and the pack, they look pretty similar in terms of pounds of manure, nutrient per ton of manure. But we all decided previously that our bed pack was going to do a better job capturing these nutrients. The reason for this, we think about a bed pack, we are bringing in bedding. And by the nature of being bedding, it inherently has very low nutrient density. So corn stalks are going to be one of our primary bedding types. We think about nitrogen, for example. Does anyone kind of have a round guess in terms of how much crude protein's in their corn stalks? 3-4%, small. And remember, on top of that, nitrogen is only crude protein only contains 16% nitrogen. And I'm not going to do the math, but it's a really little number. So we think about we're bringing in all of this bedding, which is contributing very little, and therefore diluting our manure nutrients, which is why these look pretty similar. Now, liquid manure, same setup, nitrogen in maroon, phosphate in red, potash in yellow. We have samples from lagoon and samples from deep pits under slats. And unsurprisingly, you're going to capture a lot more manure nutrients in your pit because, of course, urine and manure going to go straight from the animal into the pit. A lot less opportunities for runoff, volatilization, or even dilution with rainwater. Now, just showing you those numbers doesn't really mean a whole lot. Okay, bed pack and open lot are similar per ton, whatever. So what we did was we actually put these in a way that we can compare our different facility types. So we took the average nutrient yield per facility type and multiplied it by those manure nutrient concentrations we saw in the last 2 slides. And here's where things start to look like what we thought they would in that original slide when I gave you guys a quiz. So we have our outdoor lot right here, bed pack, and finally our pit. We'll get to this other set of bars in a second. But kind of like we expected, you're going to capture the most manure nutrients in your pit, intermediate in your pack, and least in your outdoor lot. And this is pounds of manure nutrient captured per headspace each year. Now, this last set of bars is a standard developed by the American Society of Agricultural Engineers that was published back in 2005. And what these folks did is they came up with the theoretical total manure nutrients that would be excreted by a single animal on a yearly basis. So what we did was we went back and compared our numbers to this standard, a little quiz for ourselves. So we look at nitrogen. We compare each of our different facility types to our standard. In your pit, you're going to capture 98% of the theoretical nitrogen excreted. That's pretty darn good, right? Our bed pack, intermediate, finally our open lot, we're going to capture the least with 40%. And of course, a lot of volatilization happens in our outdoor lot. We will skip phosphate for a second and look at potash. While we're not capturing quite as much, it still follows the same general trend. We're capturing the greatest amount in our pit, intermediate in our bed pack, and finally the least in our outdoor lot. Now, I skipped phosphate for a reason, and that's because the numbers look a little bit weird. Now, I'm a more is better kind of girl, but we just got 100% of the standard, and that's probably not quite right. Do we have any ideas as to how we could possibly get more than 100% of the theoretical phosphate captured? Dun, 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 quiz time. Not the bedding, but we are doing something a little bit different. Feed, okay? So think back to when this was published, 2005. So the data from this standard is going to come from time before 2005. What was your distiller's inclusion back in the early 2000s? Very small, none. Maybe you were using it as a protein source. And distillers, of course, adds a lot of phosphate to the diet. Our numbers were generated from 2010 to 2014. A lot of that time was during a period of really high corn prices, and we were pushing distillers' inclusion really high. As a result, we were overachievers and able to capture greater than 100% of the theoretical standard. What does this really say? This standard is no longer representative of modern feedlot diets. But even with that, it follows the same general trend. Greatest amount of nutrients in the pit, intermediate in our bed pack, and of course the least in our outdoor lot. All right, the final nutrient we'll talk about briefly is sulfur, and Alfredo will share with you why we're interested in sulfur in terms of a nutrient for crop use. This is going back to our nutrient composition, so pounds of sulfur per ton, open lot on the left, bed pack on the right, and even though this is numerically a little bit higher in our open lot, statistically they're not ever any different. So this looks pretty similar to what we saw for other manure nutrients. And then, of course, in our liquid manure samples, we capture significantly less sulfur in a lagoon compared to a pit for the same reason. All of it goes straight from the animal and into the pit. So, how does all of this stuff that I just shared translate to value? Because that's what we're really interested in, right? Some of this stuff might be useful if you're putting together some plans for expanded construction and you want to see how potential facilities impact manure nutrients and how that would work into a manure nutrient plan for your overall operation. But for most of us, I think value is what we are really interested in.